The temperature had fallen to minus 38 degrees Celsius before dawn. Not the kind of cold that merely numbs fingers and toes, the kind that kills deliberately, methodically, as though it has a plan of its own. Frost crept into steel and, bone alike, turning breath into crystals, had hung in the air, before shattering into nothing. A soldier of the German 3rd Panzer Group pressed his Karabiner 98K against his frozen shoulder and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. He worked the bolt. It refused to move. December 5, 1941. The Klinsolnik-Nogorsk axis. 50 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The extractor, precision machine to tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter at the Mauser factory in Oberndorf, had contracted in the killing cold and seized hard against the chamber wall. What had once been a masterpiece of engineering was now a useless length of ice-bound steel. Around him, engines coughed and died. Lubricants thickened into glue. Metal betrayed its masters. In that frozen corridor outside Moscow, the German advance did not just face an enemy army, it faced winter itself. Across the white field, a Soviet conscript from the 30th Army raised a rifle that Wehrmacht intelligence officers had dismissed in their assessments as outdated, crude, and beneath serious analysis, a relic of the Tsarist era barely worth cataloging. He cycled the bolt with a bare hand. It moved. The rifle fired. Then he cycled it again. Before that morning ended, the Red Army had launched the largest winter offensive the war had yet seen. And the weapon German analysts had called obsolete junk was the one still shooting. If you love the kind of military history that cuts through the surface, the production lines, the metal tolerances, the engineering decisions that echo across battlefields for decades, subscribe right now, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We have viewers from every corner of the world, and hearing from you makes this community what it is. Now let's go back to where this story really begins. This is the story of a rifle the Soviet High Command was repeatedly told to abandon, a weapon foreign observers dismissed as clumsy, that German analysts catalogued as mechanically unremarkable and tactically irrelevant. It was designed under Tsar Alexander III, chambered for a cartridge that predated powered flight, and manufactured to tolerances that would have triggered rejection at any Western inspection station. By May 1945, Soviet factories had produced over 17 million of them. They had armed a conscript army that absorbed the most devastating land invasion in recorded history and then drove nearly 2,000 kilometers westward to Berlin. This is the most elegant M91 30s. And this is how the rifle nobody respected helped destroy the finest army in the world. To understand what the M91 30 actually was, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. And the scale of that problem was almost beyond comprehension. In 1930, Soviet military planners confronted a single terrifying calculation. If a major European war began tomorrow, how many rifles would the Red Army need to arm its mobilized divisions across thousands of kilometers of exposed frontier? The answer they arrived at was in the millions. Not hundreds of thousands. Millions of individual weapons, each requiring steel, wood, machining time, and skilled labor, all produced simultaneously, continuously, across a country still pulling itself out of the wreckage of revolution, civil war, and famine. The rifle they had inherited from the Tsarist army, the original model 1891 Mosin Nagant, was a serviceable weapon, but it was a manufacturing nightmare at the quantities Soviet planners now required. At 48.5 inches in overall length, each rifle consumed enormous raw material per unit before a single round was fired through it. Its production specifications, still partially written in the old imperial measurement system, required conversion tables on the factory floor that slowed output and multiplied error rates. The Tula Arsenal and the Izhevsk Mechanical Works, the two fortresses of Soviet small arms production, were capable facilities. But they were not yet capable enough for what was coming. So in 1930, Soviet Ordnance Committees authorized a modernized variant. They designated it the M91-30. Every change was precise and deliberate. Production specifications were fully converted to the metric system, eliminating the conversion bottleneck entirely. The hexagonal receiver, elegant and time-consuming to machine, was transitioned to a cylindrical profile that dramatically reduced machining time per unit. The design was no longer optimized for the parade ground of the Imperial Russian Army. It was optimized for the assembly line. The weapon kept everything had earned its reputation over 40 years. The 4-groove right-hand rifling. The powerful 7.6x 54mm rimmed cartridge. The 5-round internal magazine, stamped from sheet steel, needing no precision spring assemblies. The bolt contained just 7 major components, compared to the 42 parts inside the later semi-automatic SVT-40. A conscript who had never touched a firearm could field strip it completely in under 20 minutes using no tools beyond the rifle itself. Stalin's 5-year plans poured resources into production expansion. New manufacturing lines were established at Tula. Duplicate tooling was built at Izhevsk as deliberate redundancy, insurance against the factory losses that Soviet planners, already thinking in terms of total industrial war, quietly expected would come. Each rifle consumed approximately 10 kilograms of raw steel, accounting for machining waste. Multiplied across millions of units, the material commitment was staggering. But, by 1939, Soviet production was measured in the millions annually, and by the summer of 1941, warehouses across the western military districts held stockpiles representing the largest concentration of individual small arms anywhere on Earth. The Soviet Union had industrialized its way to a rifle army. But the test was arriving far faster than anyone had planned. June 22, 1941. Dawn. The entire length of the Soviet western frontier, 3.8 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory in the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. German armored columns drove 100 kilometers on the first day alone. Entire Soviet armies found themselves encircled before their commanders had finished decoding the initial attack reports. The Red Army, still mid-reorganization in the aftermath of Stalin's devastating purge of its senior officer corps, began fracturing under pressure that no peacetime planning had genuinely prepared it for. The rifles came out of the warehouses by the millions. Men who had been farmers and factory workers 2 weeks earlier received their M91-30s at formation and were told to march west toward the sound of the guns. Some had received fewer than 10 days of weapons instruction before they found themselves in contact with German infantry who had been training and fighting continuously since 1939. The disparity was not in the rifle. The disparity was in everything surrounding the rifle. But the rifle was what they had. And the rifle had its own problems in those first catastrophic weeks. At 48.5 inches, the M91-30 had been designed for an age of linear infantry formations, for men standing in open fields with room to maneuver. In the mechanized chaos of Barbarossa, Soviet riflemen trying to dismount from trucks, fight from shallow slit trenches, or clear burning buildings found the weapons full length working against them. German infantrymen with their 43-inch Karabiner 98K carbines moved through tight terrain with a real tactical advantage. It was fractional. But, in close combat, fractions are fatal. At Minsk, in early July, German encirclement operations captured nearly 300,000 Soviet troops. Wehrmacht teams cataloging the abandoned equipment noted something unexpected. The M91-30s were not discarded in panic. Many were clean. Many still loaded. The rifle had not failed the soldier. The situation had. The 7.6x54R cartridge was a closed system, incompatible with every German weapon in the field. When supply lines collapse, and they collapse everywhere, relentlessly, through that terrible summer, Soviet units did not improvise by raiding captured German ammunition. The rimmed cartridge, that had served the Russian army faithfully since 1891 became a logistical trap in a war of encirclement and disrupted supply. Rifles were abandoned not because they malfunctioned, but because the ammunition chain behind them had been severed. German intelligence officers drafted their summer assessments with quiet confidence. The M91-30 was noted as serviceable but dated, a bolt action in an era increasingly shaped by automatic fire. Mechanically unremarkable, the Wehrmacht moved on to larger concerns. They should have studied the rifle more carefully. August 1941, Smolensk. The temperature had swung to 35 degrees Celsius. The Ukrainian and Belarusian soil, ground to powder by millions of boots and thousands of tank tracks, rose in columns visible for miles. Every weapons system on the Eastern Front was being tested in conditions no laboratory had replicated. German forward units began reporting elevated stoppage rates. The precise tolerances of the Karabiner 98K and the MP40, engineered for controlled factory conditions and temperate European climates, were encountering the cost of their own precision. Fine dust worked into the tight gaps between perfectly fitted components and locked them like cement. German armorers in forward positions worked through the nights trying to keep pace with the failures. The M91-30th was fouling too. But it was fouling differently. The bolt raceways of the Soviet rifle had been machined to what German engineers privately called loose tolerances. What Wehrmacht ordnance officers had dismissed as inferior craftsmanship was, in the grinding dust of the summer steppe, becoming a functional advantage. The clearances that had caused quality inspectors to wince in peacetime were now absorbing the grit that was seizing German actions. The slop in the system was the system working. Soviet armor logs from rifle divisions in this period record stoppage rates during sustained combat lower than pre-war testing had projected. Not because the rifle was better than expected, because its apparent weakness was, in ways no designer had consciously intended, a form of strength. Then the snow came. On December 5, 1941, the same frozen morning that opened this story, temperatures along the Moscow axis dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. The Wehrmacht was fighting in summer uniforms reinforced with whatever its men could strip from corpses and abandoned farmhouses. The German High Command had assured its armies they would be in Moscow before winter. They were not in Moscow. They were in a killing field, and the cold was one of the weapons killing them. The Karabiner 98K's extractor, heat-treated to high Rockwell hardness for the precise fit that gave it its legendary peacetime accuracy, shattered under the thermal contraction of minus 38 degrees. German after-action reports document small arms failure rates that alarmed Wehrmacht ordnance staff at every echelon. Weapons that had performed flawlessly from Poland to the outskirts of Kiev were becoming useless steel and wood. The instruments of German precision were being destroyed by the cold they had not been designed to survive. The M91-30's bolt sleeve, machined from single-piece forged steel with the same generous clearances that had absorbed the summer dust, was now absorbing the winter. The thermal contraction that was fracturing German extractors moved through the Soviet rifles' tolerances the way water moves through open space, finding no resistance, causing no damage, dissipating harmlessly. The bolt cycled. The rifle fired. Soviet accounts from the 1st Shock Army and the 30th Army during the Moscow counteroffensive consistently described weapons performing through the worst sustained cold the European war had produced. The laminated birch stocks, saturated with linseed oil during arsenal finishing, contracted in the extreme cold but held. German soldiers examining captured M91-30's noted stocks that looked cheaper and cruder than the walnut on their Karabiner 98K. They were right. The birch was inferior timber. It was also the timber that did not split longitudinally at minus 40 degrees. German walnut, beautiful and strong in temperate conditions, was fracturing along the grain in the same cold that Soviet birch simply endured. The rifle the Wehrmacht had called primitive was, in the winter of 1941, the most reliable individual weapon on the Eastern Front. But the M91 1930's most consequential contribution to the war had not yet arrived. It was being assembled, carefully, in the ruins of a city on the western bank of the Volga River. August 1942, Stalingrad. The Sixth Army of the Wehrmacht had pushed through the city's industrial outskirts across weeks of brutal fighting. What they found in the urban core was unlike anything the war in the West had prepared them for. Stalingrad was not a city anymore. It was a three-dimensional maze of reinforced concrete, collapsed factory floors, flooded basements, and darkness broken only by fire and the sudden white flash of close-range combat. The enormous sweeping armored maneuvers that had defined the war until now were irrelevant here. Distances were measured in hundreds of meters, sometimes in tens. In some sectors, Soviet and German soldiers occupied different floors of the same shattered building simultaneously. In this environment, the M91-30 sniper variant became one of the most lethal tools of the entire war. The sniper configuration had been in systematic development since 1932. Selected barrels, those that grouped the tightest during factory test firing, were pulled from the standard production stream and fitted with mount brackets for optical sights. The PU scope, standardized in 1940, offered 3.5 times magnification mounted directly above the bore center line. It was not the most sophisticated optic in the war. German sniper scopes offered greater magnification and finer adjustment. But the PU was rugged, maintainable in field conditions, simple to zero, and manufacturable in the hundreds of thousands. And the Soviet training program built around it was something the Wehrmacht had no equivalent to. Vasily Zaitsev arrived at Stalingrad with the 284th Rifle Division in the autumn of 1942. He was 26 years old, and not in any dramatic sense a special soldier. He was a product of the system, a graduate of Soviet sniper schools, equipped with a weapon produced by the millions, carrying ammunition from factories running around the clock since the invasion's first week. From positions inside the ruins of the Lazar chemical plant and across the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan, he recorded approximately 125 confirmed kills before the battle concluded. But Zaitsev was not an anomaly. He was the visible tip of an enormous program. Soviet sniper schools by late 1940 were graduating marksmen in numbers the Wehrmacht's program could not approach. Dedicated coursework taught range estimation using the PU scope stadiometric reticle. Women entered the program not as a propaganda gesture, but as deliberate capacity expansion. Lyudmila Pavlichenko accumulated 309 confirmed kills before shrapnel ended her service. Rosa Shanina, barely 19 in 1943, recorded 59 before her death in January 1945. They were not exceptions. They were the output of a pipeline producing tens of thousands of trained marksmen while the war raged around them. The arithmetic was cold and simple. A trained Soviet sniper with a PU-scoped M91-30 cost the war economy a fraction of a single artillery shell. But each confirmed kill removed an experienced German soldier, a man who had been training since 1936 or fighting since 1939. His replacement would be younger, less trained, and less capable. The Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging institutional expertise it could not replace. The Red Army was regenerating its losses in men and rifles faster than the attrition could consume either. Between 1941 and 1945, Soviet arsenals produced approximately 17.4 million Mosin-Nagant rifles across all variants. German Mauser production during the same period produced roughly half that number. The gap was not the result of wartime improvisation. It was the compounding return on decisions made in 1930 on 5-year plans that Western military observers had regarded as the frantic industrial overreach of a backward power. Those decisions had built factory capacity now manufacturing rifles faster than the war could destroy the men who carried them. The Tula arsenal, evacuated under German artillery fire in October 1941, had been dismantled, shipped east of the Urals, and was producing again before December of the same year. The Izhevsk works never stopped. The avalanche of steel and woe that Soviet planners had set in motion a decade before Barbarossa was now crushing everything in its path. By the spring of 1944, Army Group Center was retreating across the same ground it had swept over 3 years earlier. The men retreating now were not the men who had advanced. Those men were gone. What remained was an army bled of its irreplaceable expertise by 4 years of a war it had expected to finish in 4 months, and advancing behind them, across every kilometer of ground from Stalingrad to the Oder River, were Soviet soldiers carrying the rifle the Wehrmacht had never taken seriously enough. The guns fell silent on May 8, 1945. The M91-30 did not. After 1949, Chinese Type 53 rifles built on Soviet tooling fought in Korea with Chinese and North Korean troops. In the same brutal cold that shattered German equipment near Moscow, the rifle worked as it had in 1941. Vietnamese forces carried hundreds of thousands through decades of jungle war. In Afghanistan 1979 to 1989, Mujahideen used Soviet sniper variants against Soviet soldiers. In 2015, observers in Aleppo again documented the PU scope in action, the same glass once used by Vasily Zaitsev in Stalingrad. Soviet engineers in the 1930s weren't chasing legacy. They were solving scale, arming millions. Birch over walnut. Loose tolerances. A simplified bolt. Every choice favored speed, cost, and volume. Precision can win short wars. But over 4 years, with 17 million rifles produced, Volume 1. The rifle mocked by the Wehrmacht outlasted them all. It was never the finest weapon of the war. It was the one that never ran out.